It's fair to say that the vast majority of movies take place within relatively compressed time frames, and that's perhaps even truer in the horror genre, which is so often concerned with the sustained tension of the heroes being doggedly pursued by a murderous force. Still, a well-placed time jump can nevertheless have a major dramatic impact, leaving the audience with no idea of what's about to happen and adding a layer of enervating unpredictability to the narrative. So with that in mind, I'm Ellie for What Culture, here with 10 sudden time jumps in horror movies that completely change everything. Number 10. Halloween Ends. Given that Halloween Kills picked up immediately where 2018's Halloween left off, it was a reasonable expectation that Halloween Ends would basically do the same, with Laurie Strode desperate to avenge her daughter Karen, who was murdered by Michael Myers at the end of Halloween Kills. But filmmaker David Gordon Green made the surprise decision to take some unexpected leaps forward in time. Halloween Ends opens with a prologue set a year later, detailing the origin story of new lead Corey Cunningham, after which we skip forward a further 3 years, with the rest of the movie taking place 4 years after the events of Halloween Kills. For all of the film's many divisive elements, the time jump is one of its more intriguing ideas, because though Michael hasn't been seen in Haddonfield since the night he killed Karen and a lot of other people, he's left behind a legacy of trauma which continues to tear the town apart. Opening a film with Michael MIA and Haddonfield unable to heal from his rampage is totally unlike anything else the series had attempted before, and at least showed some tantalizingly outside-the-box thinking on Green's part. The rest of the movie though, not so much. Number 9. Annabelle Creation. Annabelle Creation is the surprisingly solid prequel to 2014's rancid Conjuring spin-off Annabelle, and primarily takes place in 1955, but offers up quite the meaningful time jump in its very final scene. The sequence begins in 1955 with a demonically possessed young Janice calling herself Annabelle before being adopted by a couple, Pete and Sharon Higgins. But as the camera pans over to photos of Janice growing into a young woman, a 12 years later title card suddenly appears, taking us all the way to 1967. It's no coincidence, of course, that this is the very year that the first Annabelle was set, and with that the film circles back to the opening sequence from that movie where an adult Annabelle slaughters her parents, the Higgins, before killing herself. By looping back around to the first movie, Annabelle Creation retroactively improves it, while the time jump also cements the crushing tragedy of Janice/Annabelle's life, that she spent 12 years being possessed and never got her life back. Number 8. Barbarian. Barbarian is often spoken of as a movie you need to watch while knowing as little as possible, and that's absolutely true, especially as it'll ensure that the film's wildly unexpected change of both time and location lands with the desired shocking impact. The first act of the movie details Tess discovering that her rental home is already occupied by a man, Keith. Despite her initial suspicions, she agrees to make the best of it and share the place with him for the night. But the next day, they discover a secret tunnel hidden in the basement. When Keith disappears down there, Tess ill-advisedly follows, and when she finally finds him, he's suddenly killed by a naked, deformed woman who smashes his head against the wall. It then abruptly cuts to black and shifts the action from downtrodden Detroit to sun-kissed California 2 weeks later, for a seemingly unrelated plot revolving around actor AJ being fired from a TV show due to sexual misconduct allegations. AJ's involvement in the main story, that he's the landlord of the Detroit house, becomes clear soon thereafter. But this isn't the only unexpected time jump in the movie. Later, we jump all the way back to the 1980s, revealing the origins of the mutated mother and her despicable captor Frank. Though Barbarian could have just unfolded in chronological order and likely still been an entertaining movie, by adventurously transporting the audience back and forth through time without warning, it truly leaves viewers with no idea of what to expect for the remainder. Number 7. Contagion. If you don't consider Contagion a horror movie, just look at how prophetically and depressingly it foreshadowed, well, the last 4 years. That aside, it also features one of the most devastating time jumps in the genre's recent history. With a single jump cut, the director shows the unrelenting, uncaring efficiency of the focal virus spreading across the globe. Midway through the movie, while Dr. Erin Mears is attempting to trace patient 0 of the virus, she herself becomes infected. As Mia's sickness progresses, she's certainly looking in bad shape, but even in her condition attempts to comfort an even sicker patient lying in a cot next to her. At that moment, however, we jarringly jump cut to Mia's, now dead, bound and placed in a mass grave alongside many other victims, joltingly confirming that she sadly succumbed to the virus. While clearly not a huge leap forward in time, it's no less a devastating one, taking Mia's from sickness to death in a single frame, and presenting the virus's impact on humanity through an impressively detached, unsentimental lens. Number 6. It Chapter 2. Even accepting that it isn't exactly a huge secret that Stephen King's It features an epic 27-year time jump midway through the story, the fact that Warner Brothers allowed Andy Muschietti to adapt King's novel into 2 movies gave audiences the luxury of sharing that break in the narrative with the characters. Granted, it was only a 2-year wait in real time for It Chapter 2 to materialize, but catching up with The Losers Club almost 3 decades later, where they're now played in adult form by the perfectly cast likes of James McAvoy, Jessica Chastain, and Bill Hader, was quite the trip. It Chapter 2 was very, very far from perfect, but much of the tale's emotional resonance is baked into that gigantic time jump, namely how Pennywise's return to Derry forces the losers to make good on their childhood pact and reunite to defeat him for good. Number 5. The Lodge. The Lodge is a soul-rending psychological horror film which begins with a deeply traumatizing sequence in which a woman, Laura Hall, responds to the news that her estranged husband Richard is remarrying by shooting herself in the head. But the filmmakers spend just a few minutes on Laura's funeral before suddenly jumping forward 6 months in time, where Richard informs his evidently still devastated children that they'll all be spending Christmas with his new partner Grace. That huge lost chasm of time leaves plenty for the audience to consider, both with regard to Richard sweeping his wife's death under the rug and the resentment which his children have built up towards Grace for leaving her responsible for their mother's demise. Without giving too much away, both of these points end up informing the entire rest of the movie, and those lost 6 months serve as a dramatic pregnant pause of sorts, filled with sinister meaning even though we're not explicitly told what took place during them. Number 4. Friday the 13th, 2009. 2009's Friday the 13th remake wasn't perfect by any means, but it did do something relatively unexpected by avoiding just listlessly rehashing the 1980 movie and at least trying to be different by incorporating elements from the first 4 films. The opening 20 minutes of the movie depict a group of ill-fated youngsters making a camping trip to Crystal Lake, where 4 of the 5 main characters are swiftly offed by Jason Voorhees. And just as Jason takes a swing at the only remaining one, Whitney, the scene suddenly cuts to black. The story then moves forward 6 weeks, where the rest of the movie focuses on a whole new bunch of characters, including Whitney's brother Clay, who heads to Crystal Lake in search of her. Given that this remake could have just been a dead simple redo of the original movie, remixing the formula with the help of a time jump was a most pleasant surprise indeed. Number 3. Psycho. Much as the secrets of Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho aren't really secrets these days, for anyone experiencing it unspoiled for the first time, it's one hell of a ride. The expectation from its poster and premise is that the film will be a rather self-contained horror romp in which Marion Crane fends off a deranged assailant in the Bates Motel. Except Marion is of course killed halfway through the movie, apparently by motel owner Norman Bates' mother, at which point Norman disposes of her corpse and car. After this, the film moves forward a week in time, where Marion's sister arrives in town to investigate her disappearance, and Psycho basically becomes a very different movie, largely focused on a new set of characters alongside Norman. If the subversion of Marion's shockingly sudden mid-film death wasn't enough, Hitchcock pulled another one by then fast-forwarding a week, all while leaving the audience to ponder quite what's up with that Norman fella. Number 2. The Shining. A different kind of time jump now, with Stanley Kubrick's inimitable The Shining. Though the movie itself jumps forward 1 month early on, the bulk of the film's events take place within a relatively compressed time frame, and there isn't any sort of conventional time skip really worth mentioning. But the film's ending offers up one of the most unexpected, head-scratching temporal tinkerings the genre has ever seen. Following Jack Torrance's demise in The Shining's climax, a photo in the Overlook Hotel's hallway shows Jack standing amid a crowd of partiers. The date on the photo, though, July 4th, 1921, many decades before the Torrances apparently ever set foot in the hotel. This departing visual has been feverishly debated and analysed by fans ever since, though Kubrick himself asserted that it implied Jack was a reincarnation of a prior custodian of the hotel. By lingering on this dated photo, we're immediately flung back decades into the past and left to ponder the precise nature of Jack, or whoever this is we're looking at, and of course the hotel itself. A brilliant final provocation to conclude one of the greatest horror films of all time. Number 1. Martyrs. French horror film Martyrs features one of the most jarringly meaningful time jumps you'll ever see. The movie's opening scene takes place in 1971 as a young Lucy is shown fleeing from a slaughterhouse where she was imprisoned and abused. We're then shown Lucy being placed in an orphanage and befriending fellow orphan Anna, at which point the film suddenly moves forward an entire 15 years. In the next scene, a now adult Lucy bursts into a seemingly regular family's home and immediately slaughters them all with a shotgun, amid the belief that they were involved in her torture as a child. To cut so sharply from Lucy's embattled childhood to her fractured, violent state as an adult ingeniously leaves the audience to wonder what's been going on with her for the last 15 years, ensuring that Martyrs kicks off with an immediately gripping, if brutal, hook.